Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, campus minister at the University of Toledo.
A lot of times the repetitive work that I was doing, which was often packaging things or piling up boxes and so on, and working at the end of a machine, really at times freed me for thinking and imagining and so on. I did not really experience that as a terribly alienating kind of function. I don't say I was jumping for joy that I was working there, but it certainly wasn't that bad. Of course, I worked in spurts over the summers and Christmas vacations and so on, I think over something like a 9-year period.
Joining Father Bacik in today's Reflections is Glenn Hossman, the director of Toledo Campus Ministry and Metro Toledo Churches United. Today's Reflections focuses on the topic of work and alienation. Here's Father Bacik.
Glenn, you and I are now colleagues at the University of Toledo, which I am very much looking forward to. We have an office next to one another in the Interfaith Center, and we'll have the common task of ministering at the University of Toledo. So since we're going to be working together, I thought it might be good if we began talking together, and if we could do a little serious discussion here. Are you game for that?
Sounds good to me, Jim. Looking forward to it.
And to the ministry, I hope. I think that there's a lot to do there. I hope that we can collaborate on all of that.
I think that is a goal that I would have too, and I think the whole future looks exciting for the possibility of our mutual venture.
And to continue something that you've been doing with our friend Father Robert Kirchner over the years, and we'll try to build on all that went before us there. The serious conversation I wanted to have relates to the topic of work and worker alienation. And when we bring up that word alienation, it reminds us of the Marxist critique of the capitalistic society and so on. You know, in Marx's earlier works, the economic and philosophical fragments, which only really came to the attention of the English-speaking world in the 1950s, he talks a lot about alienation. He sort of dropped that word in his later, better-known writings, but picked that up from the philosopher Hegel, whom he studied under and was very influenced by. And his notion was that in the capitalistic system, the industrial society as he knew it, that workers were indeed alienated from their work and by their work. And they were alienated in a number of different ways. Alienated really from themselves, out of touch with their own bodiliness because of the great fatigue that was involved in the whole laboring effort, and that they were alienated from the product of their labor, that their labor was just a commodity bought by the capitalists, and they were put forth all this work, and whatever was produced, they didn't have anything to do with it. It was out there as an alien force and used by the capitalists in order to make money. And that they were really, it produced alienation among the workers themselves, that the very working conditions and so on didn't make for friendship and good interactions, and that even the capitalists themselves would be alienated because they would be cut off from any real human contact with the workers. Many people, when they hear the word Marx or Marxism, link it immediately with communism in their mind and modern forms and so on, and maybe are sort of inclined to turn off that kind of analysis. But I think we should take it seriously, and of course others have picked it up, and maybe we should talk a little more about alienation and the way people are experiencing that today in the workplace.
Jim, I have a very good personal example of that. I had not read Marx at that point, but when I was a freshman in college, I had the opportunity the summer between my freshman and junior year to work in, I won't give the name of the company, but it was in a factory where the sweet corn came in from the factory, and the machinery was so noisy that you literally could not hear or talk to the person just a few feet away. And as it dropped the corn down into a chute to a cutter, where I hour after hour stood and threw the corn butt first into the cutter, just one right after another, And just a foot away, 2 feet away, was a fellow worker that I could not talk to all day long, and I did this repetitive work over and over again to where I became a part of the machine. It was just rote. There was no creativity, there was no imagination, there was no process for my moral integrity to enter into it. And we began to pray as the parts of the machine must have prayed for a mechanical failure and breakdown, just to gain quiet and solitude and a few moments of rest.
You know, I had similar experiences. I don't know whether I interpreted them in exactly the same way, but when you said that last phrase about praying that the machine would break down, I remember when I first started working in a factory system when I was 16 years old, and I was so tired doing that I would find myself just hoping that indeed that machine would break down. I found myself at times, however, able to seemingly get beyond that. In other words, a lot of times the repetitive work that I was doing, which was often packaging things or piling up boxes and so on, and working at the end of a machine, really at times freed me for thinking and imagining and so on. I did not really experience that as a terribly alienating kind of function. I don't say I was jumping for joy that I was working there, but it certainly wasn't that bad. Of course, I worked in spurts over the summers and Christmas vacations and so on, I think over something like a 9-year period. But I remember one of the other workers one time asking me, you know how I liked it. I said, it's all right, it doesn't bother me that much. And he said to me, but what would you think if you knew you were going to work here the rest of your life? It's a clear remembrance in my mind, and I remember that taking me aback, and I think maybe at that point feeling somewhat of this problem of alienation, at least as I would begin to anticipate the future. But I guess what I'm saying is that when I was actually going through it, I didn't really feel that sense of alienation as you were describing it, although I know many do.
Yes, I think experiences differ, and what I think was the overriding factor was the noise pollution. I, of course, could communicate all day long with myself and my inner self and my thinking. I think that's why I survived. I also knew it was for a very short period of time, probably less than 3 months, and that was part of the saving factor. If I had had to realize in my innermost self that I would have been there at that machine the rest of my life, or one like it, I think I could not have tolerated it, or my system would have. The human capacity to adapt is remarkable, and I probably would have found some way to adapt and to adjust to that situation. But thank God I didn't have to do that, and I found my calling and vocation in a role that allows me solitude, allows me moments for interaction and communication such as this, and it is part of my lifeblood, my life fulfillment to be able to do that. The alienation, I think, comes in realizing the hopelessness of a situation where you indeed feel trapped. And many times the workplace can do that. I know there are creative efforts being made by some companies and corporations to change the workplace environment in such a way that it is humanized for interaction and for the creative process, rather than just the rote and the mechanicalness of a cog in the machine.
Those are really hopeful developments, and maybe we can talk
Absolutely.
more about those. I think that one of the things that I notice is that a lot depends on the way people interpret their situation. In other words, in Studs Terkel's book entitled Working, which is a fascinating conversation between him and these people he interviewed about their work. And you will see people doing very similar jobs, for example, factory workers on an assembly line. And they will doing exactly the same job, perhaps, and interpret them totally differently. So one person will be there feeling very alienated. He can't wait to get home, and he feels terrible Sunday night because he knows he's got to go into work on Monday morning. And it's just nothing but a drag, and he can't wait to get out of there. And sometimes they talk about these people who will sabotage the machines and actually produce shoddy work just to make it different, just to create a stir or to do something with some excitement in it because they get so bored. But on the other hand, you'll read accounts in that book by people who are doing the same thing who will talk about it very positively. They find ways to overcome it. They could overcome the communications barrier. They will, for example, find ways to talk with people around them, or have interesting conversations, or bet on what's coming down the assembly line next, and things like that, where they will somehow put a bit of creativity into what they are doing. And I over and over in that book, you would find people with dull, repetitive jobs who would rise above it in some way and find some inner meaning in that particular task, which is, I think, quite a triumph of the human spirit. You were saying before that we don't want to limit the human spirit too quickly, and I think right there we find some of the really heroic spiritual things happening. You take it in any area. I mean, you take in doing the housework. Some people will find that nothing but boring and dull and repetitive, and other people find it challenging and find ways that, to create a better atmosphere, to make the home more beautiful, to make it fit the personalities and characters of the various people in their families, that cooking becomes sort of has a creative side to it. And it seems to depend so much on what attitude you bring to it.
I think that's correct, and I think what we're really getting into now is the transition that has occurred in history from the point where we were talking in the last program about the spirituality, work being really an extension of who we are as a person. And in the early times when work was very close to home, the kind of cottage industries, when the craftsperson, the homemaker, saw that the things that they produced, the work that they accomplished, was indeed an extension of who they were. That has moved now, as we moved into industrial kinds of settings, to whole new dimensions of what that means to, say, put out a technologically developed automobile. What is a fine automobile coming off the assembly line? Is that an extension of me, or am I indeed just a cog in that huge machine that we've come to know as the assembly line? There's been a struggle since the early days of Henry Ford in theology. One of my own mentors, Reinhold Niebuhr, saw that very early as he moved as a young pastor into the Detroit area and challenged the Henry Ford empire to make the workplace a more human kind of place, to make the situations that workers had to endure in terms of the long layoffs and the callbacks and all of this a more humanized process, and has become one of our foremost thinkers of the 20th century. And the theology he developed out of that very concrete industrial setting of outside Detroit.
That was one of the great things about Reinhold Niebuhr, was his concreteness, wasn't it? He was always immersed in the real problems of the world, political and economic. And I think he's a good mentor for all of us theologically, isn't he? That when we're thinking reflectively and religiously about the situation, that we've got to be in touch with the particularities. We have to know where people are at and what they're feeling, what they're thinking, and what the systemic problems are, the structural problems that surround our lives. And I think we don't do enough of that. Too often church people have seemed to be out of touch with all of that and have really not attended to the kinds of problems that people are really feeling in their everyday life. And surely work is one of those. When we figure how many hours a day most people are at work, and those who are not working are feeling bad because they're not. So it really dominates much of our thinking, and yet theology as a whole has not stayed apace with all of that. We've not done a good job of it in the churches, I think, in responding to those kinds of needs.
Well, it's absolutely true. Niebuhr was responding as a pastor. As a young pastor, he had people in his church that when the layoff notices would come on the assembly line, it came Friday night, and you knew that you didn't have a job to go back to Monday morning, and that could be for periods up to 6 months, a year at a time. And it just, people were in kind of company housing there in Detroit. It left them wondering about their food, their clothing, their housing, education for their children. And so as a young pastor, he became concerned about that. And that's interesting that that's beginning to happen today, particularly as the middle class is hit by unemployment, that the church now is realizing that a couple of the things that it has to offer to the alienated worker and to the person who is alienated by being unemployed is that they can offer the community of the faith in support groups and various other ways to begin in this crisis undergirding and providing the necessary support for these people. They can't find jobs, obviously, but they can find ways to pull people into community. And one of the problems with being unemployed and being alienated in the unemployed situation is that you isolate yourself. And the primary function that the church can play at this point is to pull people back into socialization, because jobs really don't happen off of pieces of paper we call resumes. Jobs happen because of the interaction people have, and what better place to have interaction, trusted relationships, than in the community of the faith. And so that's a kind of a new dimension of ministry that the church is rediscovering here in this time.
You know, the church tried to go even beyond that. If you think of something that happened in Youngstown not long ago when the steel companies closed down there, the churches really actively involved themselves in trying to get the steel companies reopened and to get them into public ownership. And there was a tremendous effort made. I think fundamentally unsuccessful in the long run. But I think it made me proud at the time to know that the church leaders and some of the priests that I knew were involved in that effort. Bishop Malone was a great leader in that, and I think that that represented a part of what the church ought to be thinking about. In other words, they were trying to gather people together and get the community going on saying, let's not just sit here and allow all this unemployment to happen. Let's get these steel mills opened again. And I think another thing they tried to do was to call the corporations to task here and to make sure that corporations were not simply leaving people in the lurch and saying, well, just because we can produce it cheaper somewhere else, we're going to quickly move. That they had responsibilities to the people that were there. Again, what success they had, I don't know, but it's certainly something that the churches ought to be doing. I could start to break this down probably into two types of problems. One type is systemic or structural. That is, the whole complex web of unemployment that we have and the way the industrial complex works in the United States and how the work site is structured and so on. And the other type of problem is psychological or more personal. That is, how do we personally find meaning in our work, and how do we help those who are unemployed and are feeling alienated from their labor? I suppose it's a lot easier to talk about that second one of the personal, psychic kind of problems, but surely as Christian leaders we need to be addressing both types, I think.
I think that's absolutely correct, and a good corrective of what I said earlier. The church needs to move on both fronts, and the church is in a peculiar position to move on both fronts, because in our society, the church still has enough credibility to be listened to by multinational corporations, by the huge industrial complex entities. The church still, in our society, still has enough credibility, enough impact to call the forum that is necessary to have corporations live out and be responsible ethically and morally to their, not only to their consumer, to their stockholders for the profit, but to their employees as people who have given of their all, possibly even their whole life, to one company, one institution, and now it's the corporation's turn to be morally responsible and to find some mechanism to make sure that these people aren't dropped off late in their working years as simply disposable refuge of the corporate industrial process, and but that they are human beings with dignity that fit into God's plan, and the corporations led by the church can find ways that they can be more humane in their hiring and firing practices, and indeed in their total operation as a business in this capitalist system. Now, on the other hand, in the personal aspect, I think it's just incredibly important that the church do some sort of survey of their constituency to understand the extent of unemployment in their own parish or local congregation. And once that is done, once an informal survey as it might be, the church then can move to provide the kind of support that is necessary, simply by providing the space and the time for people to gather and begin systematically to look at exactly what is happening to them in their lives at this point. And all kinds of things can happen. Members of the congregation can be kind of monitors and listeners out there in the real world for potential job openings and job opportunities. The group itself can become supportive in the way that they monitor each other's interviewing techniques and the way they dress, the way they appear to a potential employer, and on and on and on it goes. But the point is, the church is the primary locus in our society today that can still serve that function. There aren't many other kind of humanizing institutions in our society that can provide that kind of form in this period of crisis and alienation.
The last part of what you said strikes me as really important and seems very possible to accomplish. This support group idea and being a help to people who are unemployed and helping the individuals to maybe see their jobs in a better light and so on. And I think we really could move forward in all of that. I suppose the structural side seems so much harder and foreboding, and even when a massive effort was made, as that we found in Youngstown, which is probably one of the best efforts ever made and most enlightened efforts, and they really couldn't accomplish all that they wanted to, really makes us wonder, I think, to what degree we can affect the structures of society. I'm sure that some people hearing some things that you said there would say, no, that really isn't possible, that corporations are in the business of profit making, that's what motivates them, and that's all that can really motivate them, and therefore that they're going to function in that way, no matter what you do with them or to them or how you try to touch their conscience in some way. That it just has a momentum of its own, and that if you can indeed locate in another city and get labor cheaper, that's what you're going to end up doing, and that you have a responsibility to your stockholders to do that. I guess what you and I would like to see is a more humane attitude very often brought, even if we do accept that framework, and which I think we'd still like to say, well, within that frame, couldn't we do better with those people who are dislocated and are going to be out of work and so on? Wasn't there on television not long ago a report supposedly where a corporation was letting people go? I think it's 60 Minutes as I'm recalling it. And they were letting people go when they got up around 50 years of age because they had this magnificent retirement program, and very few people had ever stayed with the corporation long enough to have ever received those benefits. And they were suing the company, I think, because they said they were let go strictly on the basis of age and in order to be deprived of these retirement benefits. Well, there we would see, I guess, an extreme example of not caring for the employees, if indeed that is the fact. I think it was just being reported. I don't know what came of it in the long run. On the other hand, I have friends who work for large corporations who tell me a very different kind of story of where they feel that they're being treated humanely, where they will tell me stories about the way the people in the corporation are being helped out, and those who are suffering being given assistance and special recreational opportunities being given and so on. So that there really is another side to this that perhaps ought to be brought out as well.
Yes, I think the pendulum can swing either way. The role the church, as I see it, has to play is to very carefully work out a kind of a primer, if you will, of what it means to be humane and at the same time be profitable. And I think one of the cliches that we can look at here that works very well for the church in this role is that to treat your employees humanely can be, and indeed possibly will always be, the most profitable route to go. And I think a good many industries, corporations, businesses see that. Many of them tout it as one of the key points to their success. And I think what the task that the church has is to simply be the monitor, the kind of goad, the kind of advocate, to make sure that is kind of a more broad-based policy in the capitalist system.
Yeah, that is a good point, Glenn, and I think that my sense of I give these talks at times to corporations, to their executives or salespeople on time management. And one of the things that results from that, it seems, is that the employees are often very grateful that something was done for them at a personal level. In other words, I come in there to give this talk just about their own personal growth and development. A lot of talk about spending time with their family and their kids and trying to develop other aspects of their lives. And it seems as though the enlightened corporation understands that that's a good thing. And very often the employees say, geez, that's remarkable that they were doing this for us and not just telling us how to sell products better. And I think that might be an example of what you were talking about. I think we have in our own community, there's no reason not to mention it, that is the Anderson Corporation. It seems to do so well with taking good care of their employees and so involved in the community and does so many other good things for the city as a whole and the area as a whole. And it seems like many people are happy with them and happy to be working with them and so on. And that seems to be another example of what you're talking about there.
Yes, and I understand the Dana Corporation as well as Owens, Illinois now have instituted exit kinds of programs for the employees that they have to lay off. And I think that's a step in the right direction.
So maybe indeed as critics of the corporations and of the society and culture as a whole, which I think that the Christian theologian and thinker and the churches must be, we can point out the abuses as well as celebrate the good things that are going on. Glenn, as we've been talking, I was thinking about your statement about how you enjoyed your work in some way, and I find myself enjoying my own work, and at times I think how fortunate we are. You know, how many people in our culture do not enjoy their work, who either hate it or find that it's stultifying or that it doesn't produce any creativity or growth in them. And I think we're really fortunate for that. And what we've got to try to do is create a society where we see more of that. We began with the Marxist analysis, and really one of his points was to create a situation where a worker would not be identified with his function, where a human being could hunt in the morning and enjoy other aspects of his life in the afternoon and discuss seriously in the evening. And it sort of is a humanizing kind of thing. And we in the Christian churches think that we have so much more to say about that and have a way of calling to task the corporations and suggesting what the good life might really be all about.
You've been listening to Reflections with your host, theologian Father James Bacik, campus minister at the University of Toledo. Joining Father Bacik in this discussion was Glenn Hossman, the director of Toledo Campus Ministry and Metro Toledo Churches United. The topic of this week's Reflections was work and alienation. If you have any questions about today's program or any ideas for topics you'd like to hear discussed, please write to Reflections in care of WLQR, Toledo, Ohio, 43623. Produced in the studios of WLQR, Reflections is directed by Mary Beth Kirchner. Reflections is brought to you by the Genesis Radio Network.